Okay, let's call to order the meeting of the Housing Planning and Development Committee. We have before us minutes to consider, and then two ordinances, 41-2023 and 42-2023, both relating to marijuana related permits for dispensaries, et cetera. So why don't we go ahead and entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the January 16, 2024 meeting of this committee? Is there second? Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? And the ayes have it. So that brings us then to our first of two ordinances, 41-2023 and 42-2023. Councilman Schachner, you're the author of both, I think. Is that right? Okay. And I know the mayor, the planning director, and the assistant law director are here. Is the administration and the law director, does the administration have, you do actually, I know that, I'll answer my own question. The administration during the workday today shared another work in progress edit to the introduced version. Is that accurate?
That is correct.
Okay, and I suspect what we're going to say is we'd like to also bring those back for discussion in a few weeks' time.
Correct.
Okay, so why don't we start as we did in the previous committee by allowing the committee to speak, especially the author of the proposed ordinances, and then we'll hear from the administration. Any thoughts from other council members? Okay. All right, Councilman Schachner, please take it away in whichever sequence makes sense.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Law Department, Ms. Swallow, and all those that had eyes on this. The purpose of these two ordinances were necessarily just to get the ball rolling on the our zoning code and our licensing regime, because there was some anxiety and misunderstanding out there by the public that we were putting a moratorium, we weren't going to allow marijuana to be sold. And this was a step in good faith to the public to say, hey, we're working on it, even though we all understand that the administration was working on it. Just trying to get the ball rolling on there.
And quick interjection, can you refresh our memory? This was jointly referred to the Planning Commission as well as
Yes.
the committee, correct?
Yes.
I don't think that Director Leininger, the Planning Commission has not yet met, right? Okay. So they'll meet and presumably have one, at least a meeting to deliberate and maybe more. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so we understand there's a process. Newly created Division of Cannabis Control is coming out with their regulations. As said at the previous meeting, the Senate has a proposal, the House has a proposal on how they want to address some of these things, specifically tax revenue and some possession.
That's a state government entity, not a county.
It's state government. Yes.
Thanks.
State government is looking at that. So I would say simply that the major changes were having our medical marijuana operation regime apply to our adult use or combo adult use medical marijuana facilities. Of course, it's up for discussion of this body of whether there's going to be different licenses for adult use or medical or the combination. I know that the Division of Cannabis just came out with some proposed regulations the other day that we're talking about a special type of license or permit for dispensaries that are combination medical and adult use. So there's a differentiation there. To me, it just seemed like the cleanest way to do it was to update our medical, remove the word medical, and just make it marijuana all-encompassing. You're not going to have a different type of license for medical or marijuana. The requirements are going to be you have to follow the requirements that are either set forth through 3780 and the Division of Cannabis Control or other subsequent regulations under Chapter 3780 that will later be found in the Ohio Administrative Code or as currently and or with the Pharmacy Board and under the state's medical marijuana regime. So that's really the long and short of it. There are some things that are up for discussion that I think this body should consider in their deliberations on deciding what we're going to allow in this city. We currently have a prohibition against any cultivation or processing in the city. And I don't know if testing, I don't remember if we have prohibition against testing facilities. But they're listening to the testimony at the State House. There was discussions about, well, why do some cities ban processing? It's because of concern of smell that could come from the processing and getting the butane oil and the burning of the cannabis in order to get the oil that could be then made into different products. However, there were some processors that were educating the committee members there and talking about how, well, smaller, more boutique processors do not use an artificial speeding up of by using butane to burn certain items to get the oil. They use a more of a drying process that takes a longer period of time and has less of a smell, and they have certain devices that mitigate it, even in some cities that do allow, and some cultivators were talking about how they do have some products that they use in their cultivation indoors in order to mitigate or eliminate any odor that comes from the facility. So I think that's ripe for discussion of whether the city wants to be open up to that with requirements about how things are to be processed if we allow processing here in Lakewood, or how we'll allow cultivation if cultivation is to be allowed in Lakewood instead of an all-out ban. Of course, an all-out ban, as we do now, is the cleanest, involves less thinking, but if we want to be a space for certain businesses or entrepreneurs, and we have facilities that can accommodate in a way that it will not be a nuisance to our neighbors or the rest of the community, I think that's something that is worth looking into. Besides that, there's not much to the changes besides deciding if this body would like to license adult use only dispensaries differently than medical, then that's something to discuss. Because as it is now, or as I propose, we will just regulate everything the same. I know there's some terminology differences that in my brief, I'm sorry, I wish I could have read more of it. I appreciate you sending that over in terms of licenses versus certificates or compliance and things like that, which I'm sure the administration will educate us on. But I'm glad that we are now thinking about how us as a city are going to approach this. I would say that another thing that was to be on the lookout for is that currently, as written, you cannot have, and I think this matches up, it really doesn't really need to be said because it matches up with the state regulations and that are coming down in terms of how far they are to be from a school. But one thing is to consider is how far do a dispensary needs to be from each other, right? And I put it, so right now it's 1,000 feet. That's what it currently is for medical dispensaries, and I propose just keep that for medical or adult. I clarified in there that this doesn't mean you can't have a combo medical or adult recreation use in the same facility. But that's something to consider. Do we want to limit the space between each one? Do we not? We do that for tattoos currently. So that's something to think about too. But really, that's long and short of it. Most of it keeps it the same. It's just making the medical licensing the same as would be for adults. But it also, one thing that was brought up, I think a year ago, was when the state changed the law where you're not permitted to take a percentage of gross profits as part of your licensing or part of your fees. That repeals that section, which is now, because I know that was in discussion a while ago, and I think we've had some time to think about it, but that's up for the body too. So that's that's pretty much it for that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Shackner. Let me frame up a couple questions firstly. So okay, I want to know the difference between the two proposed ordinances, but before getting to that, how's the state law structured? So the division of what control is it?
Cannabis.
Cannabis control, is that law enforcement or is that licensure?
Regulatories, like under the Commerce Department.
Okay, so all of the rulemaking regarding how a business can get a legal permit to operate in this space, okay? And separately, there's law enforcement, but that would just be state police and/or local law enforcement, right?
Right, that
That
wouldn't
was
have
the
to do
previous
with
committee.
Division of Cannabis Control.
Okay, very
That's
good.
just like the Board of Pharmacy within medical.
Understood. So second question is, you know, what set of decisions are allowed by the state law for local governments to make? And I'm hearing from you that there's a series of several decision points, and maybe we don't have a succinct summary here, but often these conversations are, you know, the state's mandated, for example, you know, the traffic code update. We essentially comply with the traffic code update. There might be some slight variations where our code can enhance, but not fundamentally change. So it would be helpful to understand what discretionary decisions the city can make under this structure of the law passed. And it sounds as if the state legislature may follow up as soon as they can get on the same page with one another with some amendments to this. So we might be making city policy in 2 rounds, essentially, right?
Mr. Chair.
Yes. Ms.
A
Baker.
lot of what so to answer your larger question about what's our role, it's primarily, and this is where these sections are seeking to be amended, it's land use based, right? It's
Local government traditional zoning.
yes, and
powers.
you were on council when I was on planning commission when the medical marijuana dispensary, you know, regulatory framework came out, and it was more so based on distance from one another. Same thing with like tattoo parlors. You didn't want to have a bunch clustered together, and then just intensity of use, right? So how many people are going to come there, what the customer's going to be like, what the parking demand is going to be, what the safety demand. So those, as you look through, those are the kind of things that is squarely within local government. And I don't know that the state would mess around too much with that. I could see them messing around more with like how to get a license, you know, what the licensure fee is, maybe messing around with like the local government take of the money, you know, that was proposed in the you know, referendum. So
Okay.
those are some of the things that I think, but it won't really affect this land use stuff. I think will be
Much or most of what we're considering today.
I'll put this there under 3780.25 is spells it out. It's local authority regarding adult use cannabis operators, and plainly the clearest it says the legislative authority of a municipal corporation may adopt an ordinance by a majority vote to prohibit or limit the number of adult use cannabis operators permitted under this chapter within the municipal corporation or within the or it talks about townships.
Okay.
Like that. And there's some other things that mostly have to do with townships. But yeah, that's really, as Mr. Baker said, we could outright ban it. We could limit the number of them. We could do the spacing. Most of the stuff that's in the code right now mimics the regulations that are coming forward about like advertising and things like that. But we'd be able to control how they advertising because we have control over
Most of what that's in the code?
So currently in our medical marijuana, it mimics the regulations that are put forth from the state about how you advertise for
Medical marijuana.
medical marijuana. You can't
Now
have giant signs up, you can't show the product, and things like that, and how the building looks, and you can't see inside the building, and
So
things.
some of those things could potentially change for the new category of use.
It could change, but we would still have, I believe, authority, because it's not to be more restrictive in terms of if they said, if for some reason the state regulators were like, you could put a marijuana leaf on everything and show people smoking in your window and have it clear so anybody could see into it, I believe that we'd be able to say, hey, no, if you want one in our facility, in our city, you would have to have like blockout curtains. You can't put that type of.
Okay, that's a helpful, and I want to open up too, but the one point, though, that follows on this discussion, and it's helpful to recall, medical marijuana decisions that were before the city government previously, at the time, there were a very limited number of licenses, and the state controlled that, and the question was whether Lakewood would get one at all, and then at some point, we estimated that we would get one, and it turned out we got two, because it worked out that way. I think there was, you know, the proposed applicants were able to, you know, conform to Lakewood laws, plus they were able to, I think, earn in their application based on some point system to the relevant panel to get enough of, you know, two from the allocation of Cuyahoga County, if I recall correctly. That doesn't sound like we're in that world at all here.
We are in that world.
We are or
yeah,
not?
we are, because it will be the same thing. They do it by regions, and each region has a certain amount of licenses they're allowed to.
Do we don't know? Do we know those numbers
They're-
initially, or those are
I
still
believe
coming?
those numbers did at least initially come out. I don't remember the exact number, but the thing is that just like with the medical marijuana, any license would be predicated on being able to obtain a license from the state. There's also this whole provisionary license regime that is within the state and accounted for, that you'd be able to show, and I believe was talked about in the new proposed regulations too, that would be acceptable to get at least started on the process here in the city. So it's like a two-tiered, it's a layered system. Like you have to go through our requirements, but really the first major hurdle is you got to get the license from the state.
Okay. And so what I'm driving at here is, in the immediate future, meaning the next 5 years, let's say, the best educated guess is that the number of, the ceiling on the total number of permits under the new adult use would be what, dozens, hundreds, or more like half dozen or fewer?
In terms of, sorry?
Well, total number of permits. So that, I mean, that informs kind of our zoning decisions, because if we're zoning and permitting hair salons or bars, you know, there's plenty of accurate jokes that Lakewood has a bar on every corner. The density use questions that we're allowed to regulate are look one way. But if we're really only talking about 2 or 3 or 4 licenses in the whole entire city of Lakewood, at least for the next few years, that's a different, you know, intensity of use to regulate. So, you know, I hope I'm not asking you to have a crystal ball about stuff that only the state can determine, but I'm curious to know how much information we have at this stage about the total number of Northeast Ohio or Cuyahoga County permits. I don't know, but
I think there's going to be 80 or something new permits in the state. 80 or was it was? Don't quote me on that, but I know one thing that's especially important to consider in terms of the city is that there's a provision that any of the medical marijuana is like eligible for that permit, and they're basically grandfathered.
okay.
So
And
we
then
have
so
at
the
least
last
two.
thing, and then I'll let others go, is so Councilman Schechter, your proposal is to say, let's build on the strong performance of our 2 successful and compliant medical marijuana pharmacies, and you know, learn the successful lessons of that, of those policies and those business operations. But the city council or the administration is also free to do it differently. But that's where you've started, and you
I'm
recommend.
saying it seems to work so far, so.
Councilman Baker.
Yeah, and I do think, and I'd be interested in the administration's take on this, right? How much interest have we gotten from potential businesses that would like to come into town that would perhaps inform? I do know that the existing, you know, the RISE facilities are interested in doing adult use, and they have the right to do so under the current regulatory regime. What the one thing I think we should consider as we go through these provisions related to land use, and particularly when I was in Planning Commission, I remembered, you know, when you talk about medical use, it was people that had serious medical issues. So site access, accessibility, the ability for them to park close to the facility to, because mobility issues. There was also a public safety component because there was a concern about cash transactions. So I just endeavor us in the administration to think about that creatively because adult use will be different, right? People that have medical recommendations will still, go to those medical facilities to get them. And I understand that they will have priority and pricing preference over adult use, and that the taxing scheme will be different whether you have, a prescription or a recommendation versus if you're just going to buy adult use, without a recommendation. So that's the only thing we may want to think about, what the sites look like, what the sizes of the buildings need to be, what the site access needs to be as it relates to just an adult use facility as opposed to a medical facility. Because medical facility is like, this is a pharmacy where people who have debilitating conditions are going, right? So that's just something we should think about as we go through this process.
So Councilman Schechner, the concept would be that the more rigorous standards of the medical use pharmacies could easily, one might argue, handle the less rigorous standards of adult use. But the converse may not be true, to Councilman Baker's point, that, the converse would be that you wouldn't need to require all of the high rigorous standards of medical if you had a separate adult use only license in business, potentially.
Yeah, that is correct. You can set it up in a way, as said earlier, and it's up to us to figure that out if we want to have two different licensing regimes and two different standards for medical and adult use.
Okay.
That's something to think about.
So it's helpful to know the questions that we're here to evaluate. And again, as in the previous committee, I approached this with an open mind, just trying to be educated and then thoughtful in how we make some initial policies here. Any other council members before we call on the administration? Councilman Baker, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I seem. Thank you, Chair. The last time we had, industry members that kind of, I believe it was Tom Herron, was at a lot of the Planning Commission meetings and council meetings. I think selfishly he had clients who wanted licenses, so he was willing to do that. So I don't know if we go through this process to where we might be able to get some industry expertise as well. I think it would be helpful. I think we want to, because we obviously want to craft something that first and foremost works for our community, right, and the folks that live here and the businesses that already exist here, but then also creates an environment that, allows the businesses to prosper and grow in Lakewood.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we should have a working understanding of what the realities of operating a successful and responsible business looks like, and I certainly don't know those things. So, it makes sense to me to engage and be thoughtful. Okay, any other? Could we hear from the mayor, the law director, or the planning director, or whomever would like to talk from the administration? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to start out, we'd like to identify two issues, two considerable issues that we have identified. They're drafting issues, but they really are legal strategy issues. The policy is set in the draft ordinance, the policy of imposing a fee. And I'm confident that's the policy of the mayor as well. So the law department wants to affect that policy. But here's what we're up against, okay? It was mentioned earlier about the Ohio statute that puts great limitations on our ability to impose a fee. And right now, that statute reads that we're not allowed to impose a fee based on gross receipts, but it goes further. It says we're not allowed to impose a tax or fee that is the same as or similar to any tax or fee imposed by the state. That's pretty restrictive. So the first question is, what is the tax and fee imposed by the state? We need to know that so we know how to think about our fee, the substance of it, the basis for it, and certainly the wording of it.
To clarify, the fee you're talking about would be the city's fee to review and then ultimately grant a valid permit, and what the price of that is. Is that what we're talking about?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct. So the Department of Cannabis Control is going to set forth a fee structure, presumably. They have not done so yet. When you look at the medical fee structure, we know there's a fee structure for medical dispensaries, and that's issued by the Pharmacy Board regulator. And the fee structure set forth by the state of Ohio for medical dispensaries references a licensing fee, an application fee, a certificate of operation fee, a renewal fee, a change in ownership fee. But if you just look at licensing fee, certificate of operation fee, from a drafting standpoint, we're going to be very careful not to call our fees those, because we're prohibited from issuing a tax or fee that's the same or similar to the state. Again, this is not adult use, this is medical only. We've yet to hear what the regulator is going to call their fees for adult use. So originally, the medical dispensary ordinance of Lakewood referred to a licensing fee, and I think that's the language that the proposed original draft maintained, because it's what was in there. The draft does omit reference to the gross receipts, but as of now, it's referred to as a licensing fee. The law department, you see, we are looking at language, a compliance fee, et cetera, because it would be an unforced error of us to call our fee the same thing the state's calling their fee, and then to try to defend our fee to say it's not similar to the state's fee. So we don't want to make that unforced error. It's substance over form. Language matters, but we need to make sure we have a substantive basis for our fee, and we are thinking about that. We are thinking about human services demands, potential law enforcement demands, and somehow we can structure a fee designed to fund initiatives to deal with perhaps what we don't know might be coming down in the future, cost to the city, external cost to the city as a result of this private enterprise.
Right, because federally, this is all still illegal, right?
Yes, and that's a great point. Usually you have federal regulators defining this. We don't have the benefit of that.
And under, I forgot what act it was, you can't use banking services for marijuana use, so it's a cash business, right? And that carries risk, which could put a, it's possible that it could put a more of a strain on our safety forces because of that, right?
Yes, and those are the kinds of things we have to think through for substance. I can tell you the legal counsel for our medical dispensaries is very competent, has always rejected our fee, even outside of the gross receipts fee, the flat licensing fee. They vehemently oppose it. They know how to make a legal argument against it. We're going to have to be ready, and that requires us to think. And it's likely the most prudent to wait till the Department of Cannabis defines the fee structure, and that will allow us to take that into consideration as we draft. Certainly wise to start the process, start drafting, but more so thinking about these substantive issues that you just referenced, Councilman, about the safety issues. So that's a challenge to us, and it's one that takes thought from multi-departments, including council, and it's likely going to take waiting for the Department of Cannabis to speak to the state fees. That's one challenge. Another challenge I'm going to have Ms. Swallow speak to, and it deals
Before we
with-
move on,
Yes.
do we know if the state beginning to define the fees, does that time frame wait upon the legislature making whatever decisions it's making, or could they work under however many months they have to execute the, to implement the law?
They set their deadline for September 7th.
Okay. So a ways off, but at least it's a hard date, kind of a hard date. That's their intended hard
Yeah.
date, so that is not indeterminately far off in the future. So it sounds as if even without additional legislative action, the state regulators have some authority to begin to define these pending questions. Okay, just wanted to get that clear. Did you, okay, Ms. Swallow, do you want to?
So the second issue that we're seeing, and Councilman Shackner kind of referenced this earlier, that the Department of Cannabis, or Division of Cannabis Control, has put out a set of draft regulations. They closed comment on those last week. Again, they delineate between adult use, medical use, and then a dual use scenario. One of the things that is in those regulations is a prohibition on having an adult use dispensary within 1 mile of another adult use dispensary. I don't know how that plays out. I don't know, if that's actually going to become a regulation. But again, it's kind of another reason, like, Director Vargo said, drafting now is great, but we probably want to see where those regulations end up before we finalize anything.
And was that adult use only, or a mile from adult use and or mixed use? Or we don't know?
It's an excellent question. One of the other things that stood out in that draft is that they intended, obviously if this draft is adopted, to have applications for adult use and dual use dispensaries available by June 24th, I think it was. So it kind of shows their intent maybe to kind of move that up more quickly than what the legislature is requiring, or what is required in the legislation. Also, on a side note, just on the zoning part of this, I did, in the draft that was provided from the law department, add a line in, and this is certainly for discussion purposes and policy discussion, setting possibly a maximum number of adult use dispensaries that we would allow in the city. We do have that 1,000-foot, and we have a map that shows pockets where they could be, but, is there a number that would be appropriate to limit to, ease the potential burdens of adult use dispensaries on other businesses in the close proximity to residences.
Okay, thank you. What was the point about the date, the June date? I missed it.
Just that the draft regulations indicate that if these regulations are adopted, those applications will be available on the Division of Cannabis's website by June 24th.
Okay, so in other words, industry, people who want to open a business as early as June might start applying
Well, they could begin applying in June if that is adopted.
to the state, and then after they presumably get a valid state permit, they would come to the city of Lakewood.
With medical, when that was new, it was kind of a dual process. They applied with the city along with their state. So part of our application process was, if they didn't already have a license with the state, they could provide us their application. The state would reach out to us on each of those applications for a certificate of zoning, asking the city whether or not this facility that had been applied for, whether or not they could comply with our local zoning regulations. It was quite a process.
And do we know yet for adult use and mixed use whether a similar dual track process will apply or could apply?
I can tell you that RISE, for their East End dispensary, has already come to Planning Commission for an expansion of their existing conditional use, as well as a parking plan, anticipating obtaining an adult use license. So, they're kind of ahead of the game because they already have a medical license, but I would imagine that if new adult use dispensaries were interested in coming to the city, that kind of would be a dual path.
Okay. As a side note, I think it's relevant, though. Is it the same operator for both RISE facilities in Lakewood,
Correct.
East and West? Okay, and they might also apply to the West, or did they eliminated that because they don't have enough space?
So, from emails that I have received, I anticipate that they are going to be applying for an adult use license there as well.
Okay,
They don't have the space there for parking that they have at the East End site, so it probably would be on a much smaller scale.
okay.
And it's not as close to the freeway, it's not as accessible as the East End dispensary is.
Okay. It does seem, I understand from some of my colleagues have taken a tour there. I think Councilwoman Marks and talked about how appointments are scheduled under the medical use business model / license. I don't know if that would also apply to the adult use. It does seem like we do want to get some experienced operators to give us a working sense of how, I've got a big lot, I'm going to fill it with cars, and everybody can shop at the same time, versus I have a small lot, and we're going to stagger them over time.
Right.
Which is better from their perspective, and that might very well be a different answer from the city's perspective.
Correct. Based on the information that RISE gave us during their planning commission reviews, it did not sound as if there would be appointments. There would still likely be appointments, and the medical consultations would be handled differently. But they did talk about having up to 16 employees dispensing at the same time.
Compared
So
to
they're
what
talking about
count today?
a large turnover, large magnitude volume sales.
So, okay, yeah, so 16 employees in a store is more akin to a large, drug mart store or something. Do you know how many employees are at a RISE in a given average day today?
I have no idea.
Okay, all right. So it sounds like we've got two different business models, and we would do well to get ourselves educated about the adult use, just to understand and make intelligent decisions about the questions that are in the proposed ordinances in front of us. And I appreciate Councilman Shackner for taking the lead on this. Councilman, maybe a little bit of feedback from members of council. Are there guiding principles that we approach these questions with, in any particular direction? I mean, maybe discussing that a little bit amongst committee and council members would give us some sense of direction to go in. Councilwoman Marks?
Yes, I did have a tour with several other council members of the RISE facility at the East End. I'm happy to arrange that because I know you couldn't go. Councilman Bullock, if you'd like to go, I can arrange that for you. And I'm sure that they would be able to come in and speak to council as well as to how they run their facility. I do know, though, when I was there, they have just started taking debit cards. So they can't take credit cards, but they can take debit cards, I believe. Pardon me? I think certain types of debit cards, yes, they can take. But they anticipate that may change as well. But they are expecting at the East End store to have a lot of traffic. They do not have to have appointments to get in. And when I was there for the tour, I was really quite surprised at how many people were just, coming for their medical marijuana. I was really surprised. But they have, and they do have to schedule appointments to see the pharmacist, and they have consultations. So, I mean, it's really a very well-run organization, so I think you would appreciate that with a visit. So I can find out from you when it works for you, and then I can try to make arrangements to do so and let Ms. Spock help facilitate that for other council members as well.
Sure, I'll throw in a comment. We don't have to recreate the wheel here. We know Michigan successfully sells marijuana, as does Colorado and the entire country of Canada, right? So I think when you talk about getting some input from people that are doing this, it might be helpful to look at those places and find out what their best practices were as they got into this market that we don't know anything about at this point.
To that point, definitely agree with Councilperson Strebig. I think the concern for us will be, so Rise is an operator, is in many different states. I think they're a Chicago company. So they have been involved in medical to recreate, to adult use conversions in other states. So they'll have lots of good experience. I think our task as a city administration and as a council is going to be to make sure we don't let the medical dispensaries kind of regulatory capture the market in Lakewood, that we create an environment that works for us, not just them, right? So it might be that there are 2 adult use dispensaries in Lakewood and there are 2 existing ones, but I think we owe it to the city and we owe it to ourselves to explore a world in which we can create an environment where maybe other businesses can come in if it works for us, if it works for the state regulations, if it works for all of those things. And to Councilman Schachner's points about cultivation, those are things that I view no different than, the industrial zoning in Lakewood. There are some parts of Lakewood that have industrial zoning, mostly towards the southeast end of town near the railroad tracks and Brea Road. So those are areas that, as long as, just like you wouldn't want a factory next to a bunch of residents, you'd probably want to separate some sort of like production use from residential areas. I think we should be thoughtful about that as well, to create first what's best for Lakewood, and then second what can work within the industry to allow that growth and to allow more tax revenue and more use to come into Lakewood.
Yeah, and to piggyback on what Councilman Baker was saying is that we're in an interesting spot of where Lakewood is situated here on the west side, where we have neighboring cities in the area that are just outright banning any sort of facility. So Lakewood could be an area, if you're on the west side of Cuyahoga County or Cleveland, that people go to purchase from Rise and things like that. And again, the things that we should be thinking about, as Councilman Baker was saying, is what's going to be best for our residents, where, if we're allowing all different types of these things, where do we want them to be or be restricted to being? How many do we want? Is that something we'll let the market decide, or are we going to put a cap on it? And again, just how far apart and where they should go. So I think those are all things we need to think about. What types of, again, with the cultivation, processing, and dispensary, do we want all of the above? There's a place for each of these businesses depending on where they are situated, in industrial zones only, in commercial for others. And it could be an opportunity for the city to have a foothold in a industry that may benefit not only our residents with medical and things like that, but with jobs and with proceeds that will assist us in updating our infrastructure and so forth and so on there.
Thanks for a good discussion by council members, and I agree with Councilman Baker's point, that step one should be framing up a policy from the community's perspective. What's a community good? Point well taken about regulatory capture by an industry. That's something that we see repeatedly in state government in other industries. One or two follow-up questions. Are there state licensure caps on not the dispensaries, but the other 2 things, the cultivation and processing?
Yeah, they're different. They're like type 2, type 3 licenses.
In other words, there's going to be a total number statewide. They'll parcel them out by region. So the question for Lakewood
There's
is
like dual use. I know a lot of the processors were upset that, cultivators were allowed to get also a dispensary type license. So they were basically, it's almost like having a brewer not be able to have a retail
okay.
thing there too. So there's a lot of.
So there's some of that still being defined. But the point is that the decision for Lakewood isn't, 0 to unlimited. It's going to be 0 to some relatively limited number. That's the range, is what it sounds like. The other question I have is on volume. So Assistant Law Director Swallow asked a good question. Do we have a total limit on dispensaries, which is what I've been primarily inquiring about just starting there. And, is there volume? If you've got a supermarket, one location sells a lot and could potentially have a lot of impact as opposed to many 5 and dime stores, So I'm uninformed as to whether the way a dispensary could work is that you could have one or a small number of very large operations, and that on their own could, be enough or more than enough versus, and I guess I anticipating the zoning lawyers on the panel here, they're going to say, well, it depends on the local rules and how big you allow the operation to be local.
Too is kind of, I mean, you heard over and over again in the hearings about small like processors and cultivators that are like, well, these big dispensaries that have footholds in all these different states and things like that, they have their own product. They're not going to put your product in there. So it's like having, a Walmart, and they make deals with Coca-Cola, and they make deals with this and that. And if you want to sell in their store, you're going to have to cut your price to this amount. So that might be your big dispensary in there. But you could also have your smaller ones that have different products that you're not going to, like, let's say Trader Joe's has their own stuff, right? You can't get Trader Joe's. Arguably, you can. It's a different label. Same thing, different label. But boutique like Nature's Oasis, right? They have certain products there that you're not going to find at Mark's.
Yep.
It's kind of that situation.
Understood. Yeah, and that's the last point, is I recall that Rise won the licenses for the medical dispensaries, and I hadn't heard of them, and they weren't the ones coming to city council to get introduced and get to know the local ordinances and all that. But they were awarded because they won the most points in the state application system, and it was, I think, precisely because they were an experienced, larger multi-state operator. So they really were able to leapfrog over the competition because of the scale that some of our deliberations talked about. So interesting stuff to think about. Appreciate the thoughtful approach. Does the administration have an answer to some of what council members have been, framing up here? Like how should we be thinking about this? I've heard that the law department wants to be very diligent in how we draft, but from, for example, planning director Leininger's perspective, is there some principles that you want to keep in mind for the planning department and you encourage city council to keep in mind as well? Or are we in early days here?
Well, as Director Vargo, and good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. As Director Vargo mentioned, we're still in the early stages here and trying to understand what the state is. Certainly, we have legislation on the books that has worked and has worked well for our community, and that's a good place to start. But we still don't know enough yet. There was a question earlier about have we received inquiries from other dispensaries, and the answer is yes, we have. They've been from Colorado, they've been from New Jersey, they've been from other places. So the fact that Lakewood does support it, the fact that other communities around us have moratoriums in place, or actually not moratoriums, outright prohibitions against marijuana uses in their communities, it puts more pressure on our community to accept these. And then that's the balancing we have to all look at and understand. What's the tipping point where this has worked well to this point, and now we have 5 or 6 or more of these in our community. Someone mentioned Michigan earlier, and that's another example we look to. When Michigan placed it, there's towns of 3,000 people that have 5 or 6 dispensaries in their community. I don't think Lakewood wants to have them at that level of scale, because there are trade-offs with them. Certainly they bring people to the community, but they also probably bring some other things to our community. So we're in the early stages. We're learning along with everybody else, and really waiting to see what the state ends up doing ultimately with their rules and regulations, because that's going to have a lot of input on how we can act.
Okay, and so it sounds like that's some important context for the fee calculation once we're more clear about what municipal fee isn't duplicative of the state fee. Hey, good discussion. Thank you, everybody. Any further comments? Okay, so we'll reconvene in the future when it next makes good sense to do that, and perhaps Councilman Schachtner and I can keep in close touch and with the administration as well. So unless there's any other comments, what I'd like to do is move to defer ordinances, well, I'll do two separate motions, or move to defer ordinance 41-2023.
So moved.
Second, motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. And then I'll move to defer 42-2023.
So, second.
Motion has been made and seconded. Any discussion?
Just one quick statement.
Go ahead.
I'd just like to thank the administration again for your work on this and for coming tonight and for spending a little extra time with us today. So thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I'll second the thanks. Okay, motion's been made and seconded. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it. Without objection, the committee is adjourned.